Right, okay, we're in Acts chapter 21 again. Just find it, Acts 21. And we're up to verse 22. And I don't know if you remember that Paul has been travelling, heading towards Jerusalem for some time. And if we get to verse 17, sorry, I jumped ahead. Yeah, verse 17, sorry. 17 to 25. When we get to verse 17, we see that he's actually arrived back in Jerusalem. And, he's completed this last missionary journey. And it's been a very successful mission, really. I know there's been opposition along the way, but as we look over that past chapter and the one before, there's been opposition, but it's always... He's come through it, and the word has got out amongst the churches, and the number of believers has increased and so on. And we read in parts so that the name of the Lord was feared greatly in Ephesus and places like that. Paul's had a successful mission by all accounts, right? And he's actually returned to Jerusalem with money that's been collected from the various churches to help alleviate the problem with the poor in Judea and in the church in Jerusalem. You'd expect to read now, really, that he's done all of this and he's come back with the money, that he's going to actually sort of have a little time of respite. Maybe a well-deserved rest for a few months or whatever, and then pick up the reins a little bit later. But that's miles from where what we find actually written down here. What we have now as we sort of start to get to this verse 17 is this, you've got actually a record of the reaction of different communities, two communities. And it goes on for some time. That of the Jews, who were generally hostile to the gospel, and really that of the Romans, who were generally quite friendly and accepting of what Paul was doing. And we've seen some of that as we've looked at these last chapters, how it's often been the Romans who've come to or the Roman justice system that's come to the rescue of Paul when he's been in some very difficult situations. And as we get over through the next 6 chapters of Acts, as we go through it, however long it's going to take, we'll sort of see that there's a great determination on behalf of the Jews to get rid of Paul. And if you look at verse 22 of chapter 22, just there it says, the crowd listened to Paul until he said this, then they raised their voices and shouted, rid the earth of him, he's not fit to live. And that was the attitude of the Jews so often. They just wanted to get rid of Paul. But, and we'll also see that there's a parallel sort of that we know too as we read through these next chapters, that the Romans at the same time protect Paul. I know he has to go on trial, but it's the justice system that's stopping him being lynched. But we'll also see that there's a parallel, right, between the sufferings of Jesus and the suffering of Paul. Not that they suffered for the same thing. Christ was suffering for the church, and Paul was suffering for Christ. But you'll see there's maybe it's just the way Luke records it, but there's quite a parallel that goes along here. If you think about it, as we go through this, you'll see that both Paul and Jesus were both rejected by the Jews, their own people, okay? They were both arrested, they're both imprisoned unfairly. Happens to both of them. They're both falsely accused and they're both falsely lied about. Well, obviously falsely lied about, both lied about. And they were both slapped in the face. Both Jesus and Paul get slapped in the face. But both were plotted against by the Jews. We know that, Paul and Jesus. And they each had to face a whipped up mob, calling for them to be done away with. I just read that verse there about Paul. And so there's some parallels there between the two of them. And I think that is Luke is just drawing that just to show, what's actually going on. And both of them actually faced 5 sort of trial or situations where they are put or called to give an account of themselves 5 times, both Jesus and Paul. And as I say, they're accused by the Jews, both of them, and they're cleared by the Roman justices. So we look at this verse 17. It says, "When we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers received us warmly." Right? There's a warm greeting. The home church, as you want to say, the sending church in many ways, welcomes the missionaries back. But, there's something simmering beneath the surface. There's just something going on a little bit that's you don't quite get from that first verse. But if we look at verses 18 and 19, the next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present. And Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And we see here that James is the head of the church. As you go back further into Acts, you see that it was often the apostles. James was there, but it's become almost like there's a senior spokesman, which is James, who seems to be the head elder of the church at Jerusalem. But the rest of the church is there as well. And also Paul is there, and he's got his Gentile supporters as well. So you've got the Jewish elders on one side and Paul and his Gentile representatives from the churches along with him. And it says, verse 20, it says, when they heard this, they praised God. Okay, so when the Jewish leadership heard all what happened about Paul, the Gentiles receiving the Lord Jesus Christ, being saved, they praised God. Then we get this word, then. This is where we start to hear what's going on. Then they said to Paul, okay? And now you could almost imagine you're going to have a face-off here. There's going to be a problem, you know. You've got the two different, you've got the Gentile church and the Jewish church coming up to face each other. Then they said to Paul, well, I mean, I don't know whether you've got a picture in your mind of how this could be, but I sort of have a picture in my mind. You've got one on one side, one lot on one side of the room and one lot on the other side of the room. But they're both the churches, the Gentile church and the Jewish church, has greatly increased in numbers, we read there, right? And so you can picture this meeting, as I say, with James with his elders of the Jerusalem church and Paul with his representatives of the Gentile church, and they could have had clashes over several different areas, several different aspects of belief. It could have been, church authority, church doctrine, and although it's not mentioned just here, I think probably this is when Paul presents the gift to the church in Jerusalem, the financial gift. It's not until you get to much later that we see in Acts 24:17 that it's mentioned that he gives the money to the church there. But there was a problem, there is a problem, and we get to it in verse 20. It says, when they heard this, they praised God. Then they said to Paul, you see, brother, how many thousands of the Jews have believed? In other words, in Jerusalem, there were thousands of Jewish believers by now. We know there was a lot at the day of Pentecost and that, but by now there's many, many believers in Jerusalem. Sometimes we don't realise just how big the early church in Jerusalem was, but I think by reading this, many thousands of Jews have believed. And this is what the problem is, right? And all of them are zealous for the law. That was the problem, right? Although they were Jewish believers, they hadn't shrugged off their tradition, right? They still wanted to hang on to the customs of the law. They wanted to observe all things of the law. And so we get to verse 21. Let me just say, verse 1. They have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs, right? So the problem was not about how someone is saved. That doctrine was agreed. They knew about that. They knew that was through the blood of Jesus. They didn't argue about that. It was not going to be an argument. It was not about what Paul taught Gentile believers. And though we know he did teach them they didn't need to follow the law in every detail, and the church in Jerusalem had actually sent a letter to tell them that they didn't have to become Jews to become believers, and Paul backed up that doctrine. They had to abstain from food offered to idols and live a morally clean life as well. It was not the Ten Commandments that were in dispute. The moral law, that wasn't in dispute. It was a dispute really about rights and customs more than anything. And the big debate was, should Jewish believers continue to observe Jewish cultural practices, right? Should they do that? This is what the debate is about. And the rumour was that Paul was teaching them that they didn't need to bother with that. That's what they've been told. So verse 22, it says this, so what shall we do? The Jewish Christians who are desperate to observe the law, they will certainly hear that you've come, right? That's who they are. They're the Jewish Christians who are desperate to observe the law, right? They've heard that you've come to Jerusalem, and this is going to be a problem. So verses 23 and 24. So do what we tell you. And this seems to be a bit of a strange compromise in a way. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. You mentioned saying this to Paul, right? Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses so that they can have their head shaved. Then everybody will know that there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. Well, you wouldn't really expect Paul to go along with that in some ways, would you? I mean, you wouldn't really. In other words, let the Jewish believers see that you yourself are a practicing Jew. That's what they're really saying to Paul. Okay? And the four men mentioned had obviously taken some Nazirite vow, purification, having their hair shaved, because then you let that hair grow. We mentioned it before. Paul did the same thing earlier, if you remember. He shaved his hair, then when it grew, he had it cut off. Now it would be burnt as a sacrifice, is what these men are going to do, right? And we don't know if under Jewish, law, under the Levitical law, that Paul, because he'd been away from Jerusalem for a long while, whether he did need to have it go through traditional purification ritual or not, we don't know. In some kind of way, or was this just for show? We're not really told, are we? We're not really told. And then you've got the proposal that Paul actually pays their expenses. And that too would have been costly. He's got to pay for them to have their hair cut properly. He's got to pay for the purification process that would have involved, maybe some expensive commodities. And then, the priest would be paid to inspect them. So Paul is going to run to some expense if he goes along with this. But it says in verse 25 there, as for the Gentile believers, we have written to them about our decision that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood and from the meat of strangled animals and from sexual immorality. And we looked at that in Acts 15 verse 19 earlier, when that was what was agreed in the church. But it says the next day, in verse 26, the next day Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. Then he went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end and the offering would be made for each of them. So he goes along with it. Right? He goes along with this. And you think, well, hang on, Paul, you're sort of contradicting yourself in a way from what you've been saying 1 minute. So he's agreed with James' proposal. Okay, he's gone along with it. And he loses no time in complying with it. It says the next day he goes with it. Now look, I believe here that God has given us a good example, right? There was no compromise on doctrine about how we're saved. There's no compromise about the way in which a sinner is saved. There's no compromise in observing the moral law, the 10 Commandments. We know what they are, right? Where they did compromise was in regard to tradition or practice. Now, we know that the Jews were told to observe the law and to circumcise their children, etc. That was but we are moving from the Old Testament to the New Testament here. And Paul was saying, amongst those who were believers, what he's going to actually say to what my point is, that he's going to say, if you want to continue to do that, you're free to do that. If you don't want to do it, you don't have to. And if you're a Gentile, you don't have to observe that at all anyhow. And James seems to want Paul to observe the law in complete, everything, every part, every little aspect that he wants him to do that, right? Paul was willing to do what was required to keep the peace, to keep unity, okay? As and when was necessary. See, do you see what I mean? Paul is trying to walk a tightrope in many ways. He's appeasing the Jews, but there's also been a letter of compromise, which is they're very fine for the Gentiles, so you don't have to do this, okay? James puts forward an action that Paul could go along with, and the sole purpose was to unify the two different cultures, really, the Gentile and the Jewish culture, because they're all part of the one church. The Gentiles did not have to observe the law, and the Jews could if they wanted to. And Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, which is what he was, wasn't he? He knew that this was not a salvation issue. That's what I understand. That's the only way I can think about this, right? He knew it wasn't a salvation issue. Therefore, in a way, his actions here, that we've seen this a little bit, he pours oil on what could have been seriously troubled waters. We could argue he was compromised, but I don't think he was. And I think this is why he goes on to write in 1 Corinthians 19:9. No, 1 Corinthians, is it 19:9 or 9? No, 9:19, sorry. 1 Corinthians 9:19. And I'll just finish with this. He says, though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. For those not having the law I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but I am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all of this for the sake of the gospel, that I might share in its blessings. You see what is in Paul's heart? It doesn't mean we compromise on doctrine, we don't compromise on the things that really matter, but sometimes we can have attitudes or traditions maybe that can cause aggravation amongst ourselves. Yeah? And they're the things that maybe we do have to look at. I think this is what that's the way I understand this passage, you know. You may have different points of view, but we're going to discuss this. I'm going to say goodbye to you friends at home. You can argue this one out at home amongst yourselves in a way, but for us, I think we can discuss that here.